This is URN.
Hello, this is The Big Picture. We're live on University Radio Nottingham. I'm Felix Hawes. Joining us today we have Anoushka.
Hello.
Titus.
Hello, Felix.
And Ben for the first time.
Hello, Felix. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. It wouldn't be a show without our wonderful guests. As always, you can message in on the online website for URN. Please do, and we can read out some of your messages. So today's topics are the US Midterms, which happened earlier this week, and the counting is still ongoing. We will also be talking about Sir Gavin Williamson resigning again, and we will be talking about Boris Johnson's resignation honours. But first of all then, the US Midterms. So it was predicted that, as normal for midterms, the opposition party, the Republicans, were going to do incredibly well. And although it does look likely that they will take the House of Representatives and it's a knife edge on whether they'll take the Senate, it hasn't gone quite according to plan. And Donald Trump, who was expected to announce his candidacy for presidency in 2024, it's being reported that the Republican Party donors are meeting him to try and convince him not to run. But, of course, his support base really do like him, the party members, those that decide who should be the Republican candidate. It's important to remember within the context here that Joe Biden's approval ratings are very low. They're below 50%. I think they're around the 40% figure. Do correct me, panel, if you think it's lower than that. Yet, the Republican Party hasn't done quite so well. So my first question to you all is, to what extent was this actually moderate voters in the USA, bearing in mind moderate voters in the USA are going to be more right-wing than the moderate voters in this country, might not like Biden, might be naturally inclined to be Republican, but are very put off by Trump for whatever reason, whether it's to do with his not accepting the result of 2020 or any other aspects of his personality. Some evidence for this before I go to you, and I apologise for my very long introduction, but Andrew Neil, broadcaster, now working for Channel 4, his latest channel that he works for, was making the point that you've got a lot of states where the Trump-endorsed candidate lost, but the non-Trump endorsed Republican was able to win. I mean, Pennsylvania is one where the TV celebrity doctor failed to win against John Fetterman, a left-wing Democrat who is still recovering from a stroke, which was expected that to be a Republican one that they could win. Trump-endorsed election denier Don Bolduc, if that's how you pronounce his name, lost the Democrats in New Hampshire, yet the mainstream Republican governor, Chris Sununu, if that's how you pronounce his name, apologies if that's not, managed to win by 16 points in New Hampshire, and there's many more examples of this. So yes, back to the question, I'm sorry for my long introduction, but what do you think then, to the extent that this was Trump's doing, that why the Republicans didn't do quite as well as was predicted? Anoushka, can I go to you first?
I think this was almost entirely Trump's responsibility, kind of as Andrew Neil pointed out, in states where there were Trump kind of endorsed candidates. We did see the Democrats actually managing to take over. While it's natural for the party in power to lose seats in the midterm elections, this was kind of shocking to see actually how well the Democrats did in the key states like Pennsylvania, where they needed to gain votes. I definitely think there could be a very strong case to argue that Trump has stained the Republican parties, and your more lean Republican style voters aren't really buying into the message that he is trying to send out anymore.
Titus, do you agree with that?
I do, and I think that the other example that vindicates this point of view would be Florida. You look at Ron DeSantis and his performance. He won his gubernatorial race in 2018 by I think 2 points, so a very slim margin. 4 years later, he's come back and he's won it by 20. So that's a huge increase in his share of the vote compared to a Republican Party that has, like you said, sort of faltered and stumbled a little bit at the polls, especially those Trump candidates. the interesting thing is, as well, across Florida, all Republican candidates were lifted by this DeSantis wave. So, yes, you could say it's partly a reflection of Floridian demographics changing, the opinions of people in Florida maybe becoming more conservative, but there's certainly an appeal to Ron DeSantis, and he has bucked the wider Republican trend, and certainly it stands out against some of those Trump-endorsed candidates who performed very poorly.
DeSantis is certainly someone that we will need to talk about in terms of the future of American politics and whether or not he's going to run in 2024. I think that'll be one of my follow-up questions. Very well put, Titus. Ben, do you think that Trump is a significant problem for the Republican Party? I'm sure you, based on my knowledge of your political beliefs, believe that he would be a problem for America, but do you think he's a problem for the Republican Party to get votes?
Oh, I think he's a giant problem for the Republican Party, but the real issue is he's out of control. As in, I think when the right-wing media and so many figures in the Republican Party have spent so many years defending the indefensible, they're now realising that when he's been parroting for years these lies about the election, they're like, hang on, but it's like they don't believe us when we tell them the truth, because it's too far now. There's a large section of the party, probably over 50%, that will believe and go with whatever he says, and evidently the American public are really shook by the events of January 6th and the whole election denying and how many candidates are maintaining that stance. And it's a massive problem for them because he's a threat they see to democracy.
Just to come on to that as well, I think the other important point that maybe doesn't get talked about too much is that Rupert Murdoch and his Fox News empire have been much less supportive of Trump since 2020. I think it's reported that he, after the events of January 6th and the low loss at the 2020 election, they decided to try and move away from their pro-Trump narrative. And that, no doubt, will have had an impact on the opinions of those Republican core members who will obviously be very enthusiastic about someone like a Trump.
That's a very good point, Titus, about the Rupert Murdoch media empire. Because Rupert Murdoch's empire, of course, previously backed Jeb Bush, if we remember Jeb, back in 2016. And Trump managed to go against and win the right-wing establishment choice of candidate. But now he's been president. Now there's been a lot of action since then. There are a significant amount of supporters, as Ben was mentioning, that do believe Trump and that the election was stolen. I think there was 52% of Republican members believe Trump's comments, which are unfounded. But that's obviously 48% of Republicans that do not. So let's talk about Ron DeSantis, someone who bucked the trend, someone who's very popular in Florida. 59% of the vote, I think it ended up being. Huge support. In some aspects, he's more right-wing than Trump, but he doesn't have the sort of Trump personality baggage. Do you think we're going to see a situation where Ron DeSantis does challenge Trump for the Republican nomination? Because before, really, this week, it's been sort of a given that Trump was going to get it. But now we've been in a situation where Ron DeSantis, he managed to get more financial endorsements to his campaign at the beginning of this year. Trump is already attacking him, despite his success, by calling him things like
sanctimonious.
Sanctimonious, that's it, Titus. Yeah.
Not quite got the same ring as some of the other nicknames.
I know more about him than his wife, even.
Yes, he said that too. So, what do you think is going to happen here? Do you think Ron DeSantis is going to go for it? And if he does, do you think he will be able to get the nomination over Trump? And indeed, maybe, do you think Trump might actually not run now? Or do you think that's too humble of Trump to do? What do you think, Titus?
I think it's probably quite likely that Ron DeSantis does end up running. He will obviously scope out the prospects that he has. He won't want to make that gamble if he thinks that Trump still has enough sway with the base to stain his character and sort of defame him, which can be very damaging for any Republican candidate, even if Trump is losing his grip on the base, if there's a significant portion that still supports Trump, it can be dangerous in a primary to go into that with Trump having attacked you. But I do think DeSantis is gaining his own support. People, despite his, like you say, he hasn't quite got the charisma of Trump, but he does have a very strong record of implementing policies that Republicans like. His law about teachers and what was dubbed the Don't Say Gay law, which was meant to prevent teachers from teaching certain topics to do with sexuality or gender. I think, sex education below a certain age. That was very popular with Republicans. They'll look at that and go that he can get things done and he represents us. So if his supporters, if he thinks that they hold enough sway among regional Republican parties, he will go for it. Also, just to quickly correct the record, in 2018 he had a margin of 0.4%.
Wow,
a winning margin, which is even more impressive.
Huge victory for him. Yeah, and adding to what you were saying, Titus, he said Florida is where the woke go to die. So, which I'm sure will please a lot of Republicans. Ben, do you think Ron DeSantis is going to challenge Trump? And do you think that if he did, which way do you think the Republican membership would choose?
I think he will run, and in the more innocent days of 2016, there was a Republican governor of Florida, very popular with the media, who was going to get the nomination, and it was the aforementioned Jeb Bush. And he went into the debates against Trump, and it was the most brutal ending of a political career I've ever seen. And I think you could see something very similar, because Trump in a debate is just he's a monster. He tears people apart in debates, and he has no limits. And DeSantis, I think, whilst being a very savvy political operator, when you watch him give speeches, he doesn't really have much charisma. I don't think he doesn't. I think he's quite stiff when he's actually in interviews or in press conferences. So I think he'd be shredded by Trump in a debate. And I think most of the Republican Party is just obsessed with Trump as an individual, I'm afraid. I think you see it in... Because I've spent the last few days watching a lot of Fox News and the Daily Wire to see what their take on this pretty disappointing performance is. And it's so obvious that the reason why they've underperformed is January 6th and the election denying, but they're so afraid to say, we have to drop this, because all of their listeners, their Republican membership listeners, are going to leave. So I think DeSantis will run, and I think Trump will run, and I don't think DeSantis will win. Also, you have to bear in mind how those primaries work. They winner take all. So if there's any other candidate running, if it's DeSantis, Trump, and another guy, Trump wins by default, because he'll win on 30% of the vote in each state, like last time.
It is interesting, isn't it, that they've sort of egged up the idea that the election was stolen, and now when they've realised that might not be a necessary electorally beneficial view to have, they can't really put the jack back in the box. Anoushka, do you think DeSantis will challenge Trump, and do you think he can do it? Because it seems that Titus and Ben, if I've listened correctly, think that Trump would beat him in a Republican primary for 2024.
Yeah, see, I'm going to have to disagree. I think DeSantis could potentially beat Trump. I think if you actually look at polls, I think they were running polls before the midterms if they were the two candidates that would be in a Republican primary. I think they polled very closely together, and even in some states, DeSantis actually polled above Trump, which I think was really interesting to see. But I do think DeSantis' survival and perhaps kind of him becoming the leader of the Republican Party is very much dependent on how he decides to play the narrative of January 6th. Does he continue the Trumpian rhetoric of the stolen election, or is he going to try and move away from that? Because I think essentially that is something that is really kind of making the Republican Party very toxic. I think usually the right wing in America tend to be way more united when it comes to election days, and I really do think that these midterms have actually kind of threatened that kind of harmony that exists between right-wing voters who usually come out on election day to vote and vote usually more than Democrats. And I think it will be interesting to see who he would actually pair as his running mate. I think Nikki Haley would be a very interesting person for DeSantis to run with us for the vice presidency, because I think she represents more of the traditional pre-Trump Republican Party, and I do think that could be a winning ticket to get moderates back on board with the message that the Republican Party had, and kind of a clear indication of we're keeping Trumpian style politics, but we're trying to move away from the stolen election narrative.
Interesting. That's interesting about what you said about moderates, because Liz Cheney, who is now seen as a Republican moderate, which is interesting because I don't think that would have been seen before Trump.
She believes in elections that have results.
Yes, she does believe that Trump lost. She has said that if Trump is the Republican nominee in 2024, she is considering, she's not ruled it, she's not said she will, but she's considering running as an independent against Trump and presumably Biden, but I'll get to Biden in a minute. Some polls have shown that her getting it over 20%, so 1 in 5 of the vote. But is it actually the case that Liz Cheney might, by running, might actually get Trump in? Because as we say, it's winner takes all, and Biden does require moderate Republicans to vote for him to win. Those sort of leaning Republicans, and actually, if they go and vote for Liz Cheney, then Trump might get in. What do you think about that? About Liz Cheney running? Do you think that maybe the polls are bigging her up a little bit too much to what she might actually get? And what do you think that would affect on politics if we had a non-Trumpian Republican running as well?
I think, Felix, that the Liz Cheney would be one of those politicians who who would never vote Republican go, oh, I quite like them, because she's obviously criticised Trump. She's been part of the January 6th committee. But they wouldn't actually vote for her when it comes down to it on the day. And so in a poll, she looks quite promising. But a lot of the moderates who might express support for her ultimately will probably end up going with the Democratic candidate, if that is someone like a Biden. And then she's not going to really inspire the base. Also, just to come back on what you said earlier, I don't think that Trump would necessarily beat Ron DeSantis. What I think is that Ron DeSantis in however many months' time, maybe 8 months' time, we'll look at the situation and very carefully think about whether he can take Trump on and if he can wrestle the base away from Trump. And if he can, he will go into it prepared, and I think he will beat him. Because no one goes into a debate with Trump trying to treat it like a normal debate. They know what he's like. They know he's going to attack them personally, and he'll have thought about that. So I think it's very hard to say. I think it's probably more likely that he will run, and I think if the momentum that we've seen in the last couple of weeks continues to be swinging away from Trump towards DeSantis, he will have a good chance of winning.
Thank you. Ben, then, do you agree with Titus's view on Liz Cheney? Do you think the polls are exaggerating her based on what Titus was saying?
Yes, I do. So the only major obviously Ralph Nader running for the Greens in 2000 is widely thought to have spoiled the election for Al Gore. But other than that, the only major third-party candidate was back in the 90s. What I do think you could see with Liz Cheney, if she wants to hurt Trump, is what's her home state again?
Wyoming.
Wyoming, that's it. If she just runs in Wyoming, then she could do that, because in 2016 there was Evan McMullin running in Utah, who I believe exclusively in Utah, who just wanted to stop Trump from winning in Utah because then he thought he could block the college. He had a plan that way. If Liz Cheney just runs in her home state, maybe then she can split the vote to get Biden in. But no, I don't. I don't think you'll see Liz Cheney running for president, especially if she wants to keep Trump out of the White House. I thought you were going to say I could see her endorsing Joe Biden, but no, I don't think she will run.
Anoushka, do you agree with that?
I don't think we'll see Liz Cheney endorsing Biden. I think it's important to remember that until kind of January 6th, I think she voted the same way as Trump on 92% of things. I think it would be very interesting if she ran, and I do think it's a shame that she's been kind of ousted from her party, which seems very upsetting, especially if you think about the direction the Republican Party is going under Trump. I think if Ron DeSantis is able to beat Donald Trump in a primary, then perhaps we might see more moderate Republicans coming back to the party and actually trying to reach an agreement between the more kind of Trumpian style characters within the Republican Party and the more kind of traditional Bush types or more moderates.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot now about Republicans. We're talking about whether or not Trump is going to run, DeSantis is going to run. What about the current US President, Joe Biden, who will be 82 by the time of the next election? Do you think that Joe Biden is going to be the candidate? He said that he was not going to properly make up his mind until next year. He will be very old, and already it's arguable that he's not exactly on top form mentally if you listen to his press conferences, he seems to be a little bit lost at times. Do you think Biden's going to be the candidate for the Democrats? What do you think, Anoushka?
I do think, considering how initially everyone just thought this was going to be a Republican red wave, everyone thought that Biden would perform terribly, especially if you look at his actual approval ratings. He is not a popular president. I think he's got 39%. That's how much his popularity is in the US. But considering the actual success, if Trump is the leader of the Republican Party, people might still see him as the man who can unite more Republican-leaning and Democrats people and actually kind of force the Democrat base to get together and get behind him. Personally, I don't think he should run, as I do think he is very old. But it is very hard to actually look to someone in the Republican Party who can unite the Democrats themselves, because I do think the Democrats are quite divided within themselves, but also kind of get those swing voters in key states where they need to. It's very hard to see a candidate who could do that.
Titus, can you think of anyone that could potentially replace Biden? Do you think they should?
It is a desolate wasteland, that Democratic field. There aren't many strong personalities or people with a strong vision for what America could be that aren't octogenarians. Bernie Sanders maybe is one who comes to mind, but again, he is very old and quite controversial. I know in 2016 there was a bit of some backroom deals which kept him out and allowed Clinton to get in, but it doesn't look particularly hopeful. I can't think of almost anyone who really has a lot of energy, who has a similar maybe position in the party to Ron DeSantis.
No, I agree. It's definitely a desolate wasteland on the Democratic side. I think I believe Joe Biden mentioned in his response to the midterm results, he said this is, excluding 2002, this is the best performance for a governing party since 1962, which, as my friend said, was probably when he was first running for re-election. No, I think I can't believe he'll run. I just looking. I mean, I think he's actually done an okay job, but looking at the man, there's no way he can run again. And they're really desperate if they do. I personally don't understand why there is such a bias against Kamala Harris. I don't think she's a world-beating candidate, but I don't think she's terrible.
I think Kamala Harris is a very poor politician. She can't communicate very well. She went on a radio show and tried to talk about how she'd smoked weed before to sound cool, and it was a very painful experience.
No, I agree.
Watching that, and she is not someone to lead a major party like that. She got put in the role, let's face it, because of her ethnicity and her gender, and she just is not up to the job. I think that Stacey Abrams might have been a better vice president.
Amen. Talk about people the Democratic Party doesn't properly value. Stacey Abrams is up there. No, I agree. I don't think she's a very good politician. I just think if you're looking for people to run instead of Joe Biden, the last time you had a governing party, like when either the president or the vice president run for re-election, that sends out a pretty dire message about the state of the party. You have people like Pete Buttigieg, maybe only Pete Buttigieg, who could run instead, but no, I agree. It is a desperate state of affairs. I just think Kamala Harris is probably better than Joe Biden if it has to be one of the two.
But I don't think that would be possible, because if you look at her approval ratings as vice president, they are very low, and especially based off polls. But especially looking at her kind of reputation when was she governor of California? Senator in California. I think there is a lot of sentiment there that she didn't do that well, which I don't think would necessarily. She isn't the inspiring candidate to unite the Democratic Party as president. I think as vice president, which is kind of seen as a lesser role, I think she's fine in, but I don't think she would be able to run her party up against someone like Ron DeSantis or Trump.
It's a very interesting conversation there, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of Democrats thinking exactly the same thing. Who can we replace Joe Biden, the sort of nice enough old man, but with Kamala Harris, who, as you say, there were controversies when she was Senator of California, and she's not popular on the left of the Democrat Party either. I don't believe.
No one is.
No one is. I've got one more question that I'm going to ask before we move on, but I want to just read out some comments that we've got coming in through the system. We've got a song request from Amy, who is listening with her boyfriend James, and they're enjoying the show so far. So thank you very much for listening. Always a reliant and loyal audience. Julian from Germany is listening, so thank you, Julian. Titus is right. Hashtag Kamala out is another comment that we've got. Also, Ben is right. Neither Joe or Kamala running would make them look charismatic. Make them look as charismatic as a crisp packet in the wind. Sorry, I butchered reading that out. Hello, we're enjoying listening to The Big Picture today instead of doing our work. From Sarah, Ella, Isabel, and Daniel. Well, thank you to you four for listening as well. A very, again, loyal audience, and Ella in particular, who listens every week. So thank you, Ella. So someone's asked, who is Stacey Abrams? I think you mentioned Stacey. Who mentions Stacey? Titus.
That was me, yeah.
Titus, who is Stacey, briefly, before I ask our last question of this section?
Stacey Abrams is the Democratic candidate for governor in Georgia. She lost to Brian Kemp in 2018 and complained about voter suppression. She then ran against him this year, and I think she performed worse than she did 4 years ago.
She is also widely considered to be the reason why they won Georgia in 2020, because she was tasked with setting up their voter turnout machine in Georgia, which in many people's view won them the state. So a very valuable person to the Democratic Party in that sense.
Thank you for clarifying that. Someone's commented, I think I know who this will be, but I'm not going to say, that she's way out of her depth at this level and at every level. Seriously, I wouldn't trust her near a paddling pool without supervision. So that's a comment from someone listening. Okay, my last question of this section before we move on. We, as mentioned, the US presidential election is winner takes all by state. And there are lots of different states that are going in different directions politically. You have the Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania states that are sort of, I suppose, to the best of comparison, the equivalent of the Red Wall in America, sort of working class, formerly very strongly Democrat states that did vote for Trump in 2016 but all went for Biden in 2020. You have more of the southern states that were perhaps more traditionally Republican that went to Biden in 2020, like Arizona and Georgia. And there are other states that could follow on that line, like North Carolina, that did stick with Trump in 2020. Nevada is another swing state that did stick with Biden, went with Biden in 2020. Very briefly, then, what do you think will happen in 2024 if it's Biden versus Trump? Do you think any of these states are going to switch over either one way or the other? And also, I know this is, I said, brief question, and I'm already adding a caveat. Do you think it would be different if it was Biden versus DeSantis? Let's start with Titus.
I think that what you're seeing in some states, like the Rust Belt, is maybe an increasing importance of those socially conservative issues. Maybe potentially why they went for Trump in 2016. I think that increased voter turnout in the big cities in those states is what drove them towards Biden in 2020. But I do think that they are tending towards the Republicans, because they are those working class white voters are moving towards the Republicans. I mean, they turned out for Trump in massive numbers. So I think that if it was Biden versus Trump, it would be difficult to call. But I do think Trump has lost enough of his appeal that he would struggle to win overall. He might get one or two of those states if the Democrats can't get their turnout up in the cities. But I think that in other states like New Mexico, New Mexico's a safe Democratic state. I mean, Arizona and
Georgia.
Georgia. Thank you.
Right.
Would be going towards Biden if Trump did run again, but it might be a different story if it was DeSantis.
Anoushka, do you agree with Titus's assessment?
Have to agree with Titus. I do think that we have seen since the 2020 election and the current midterms that the Democrats are very good at actually kind of trying to unite their own base, because it is important to make sure that Democrat voters do go out to vote, because they're less likely to vote than Republicans. But the Democrats have been very good at actually trying to get those lean Republicans and those swing voters to also come to the Democrat side, who aren't happy with Trump, who don't think that the Republicans could do a better job. And I think the next thing for this next election that would be very important is actually the Gen Z voter base, as they call it in America, which is kind of your 18 to 25-year-old voters who have been really key voters in these like swing states this coming midterm. I think this is becoming a kind of voting bloc that the Democrat Party and even the Republican Party, if they wanted to take away these votes, they can't ignore. Like, issues that Gen Z care about need to be more represented in US politics because they're having actual power when it comes to voting.
Ben,
yes,
do you
I
agree?
think that's a great point, Anoushka. Particularly because the Gen Z vote was, I believe, what won John Fetterman his result in Pennsylvania. And I think that's a really significant result because Pennsylvania, which is basically as close as you get, as close as a swing state gets, Fetterman won by 5 points with votes still to come in, and that was because of Gen Z. So I think that's vital. I think in Pennsylvania, I think that will go for Biden. I think Michigan will go for Biden. Wisconsin is displaying that it's a bit more red than the other two. I think Georgia's a different question. I don't actually think Georgia is a matter of swing voters anymore. I think in Georgia, you're either going to vote Democrat or going to vote Republican, but it's about how many people you can turn out, and I think the Democrats have created a very effective turnout machine in Georgia, which I think will see them continuing to eke out very narrow victories for the foreseeable future.
And I think that just off the back of that, the point I was trying to make earlier maybe was that American politics has in the last maybe decade or so really become a game of turnout. Who can drive up turnout on their side the most? And whilst those Rust Belt states may have been drifting a bit more Republican, if the Democrats can drive turnout in, especially in the cities with the Gen Zers, they can then win those states. So it's really a game of who can whip up their base to get them to make all their friends vote, to go around campaigning and get people to turn out, which I think is quite sad because it drives polarization and it's not good for politics on the whole. And maybe they should consider compulsory voting. It's a policy that I would certainly support in Britain.
That's interesting, Titus. Maybe now the Republicans are realising that by telling their voters that the election's rigged before they vote might not be a great idea to in terms of turnout. Okay, we're going to have a musical break. We've had a very extended section to the first part of the show, but I hope our listeners understand that the US midterms is quite a significant topic of this week. But our first song then is a song linking to America, Kids in America. Please enjoy.
On campus and online. This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. We've had some more messages coming in. Hi Felix, me and Ollie are really enjoying the show today, from Lucy. Well, thank you Lucy for listening, and as always, very much appreciated. We also got a complaint. Isn't that terrible? It's Generation Z, not Z, but Anoushka, I think, was using the American term, and she did say as it's said in America, so I let you off, Anoushka, on that one, because your points were also very good. So our second topic is on Sir Gavin Williamson, who has been who's resigned again, this time over bullying claims. There were some leaked WhatsApp messages from him to the former Chief Whip, Wendy Morton, complaining that he wasn't invited to the Queen's funeral. He was using quite interesting language, perhaps inappropriate language, some might say. Also, there's been reports that he's told civil servants to slit their throats. I mean, Gavin Williamson's a man, let's not forget, that's been sacked by Theresa May for leaking national security secrets. He was actually probably fortunate for him not to be investigated by the police for that. He was also removed from cabinet by Boris Johnson because of the A-level and GCSE result scandals in not 1 year but 2 years because of COVID. He was brought back. It's sort of known within at least the government that Gavin Williamson knows where the bodies are buried, and it's someone that they'd rather have in than out. But again, there has been other issues addressed to him, and he's already resigned. He was a controversial appointment by Rishi Sunak, but obviously the attention was more on the Home Secretary's return. That's Suella Braverman over him, but he's now gone. This happened, I believe, on Sunday, so almost a week ago. Ben, let's start with you this time. What do you think to all of this? This is a bit embarrassing, don't you think, for Rishi Sunak to already have a resignation so early on in his tenure?
Yes, it is, but I mean, to be honest, this is as a Labour supporter, I can't say New Labour was perfect on this when they were in government either. Like having bullying being a problem in senior management levels. I do think there is a sense of the Conservative Party that it is just every week now there's some scandal. Someone's resigned, or Prime Minister stepped down, or like the budget has crashed, or another minister has stepped down, or has broken the ministerial code. Or someone's joined I'm a celebrity. It's just like, and it does sound like you hear that in the 90s, John Major's Conservative government, not even through any fault of its own, but there were just scandals every week and people dropping out every week. And there's a sense of exhaustion, which I would say is what this figures into.
Do you agree with that, Titus?
I think I agree with the sense of exhaustion, the point that when a party has been in power for so long, they almost lose a sense of purpose, that what united them into brought them into office, their drive, their message that brought them into office has been forgotten, and everyone starts to break apart into little groups to really push what they care about particularly. But I do think I would push back on the idea that this government is very chaotic, or there's a lot of issues. Obviously, in the last 8 months, there's been a lot of problems with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, but I think since Rishi Sunak's taken over, we have seen the ship stabilise, and this is not necessarily indicative of wider chaos in Rishi Sunak's government. I think it's the exception rather than the rule.
But don't you think, Titus, it's already the case that Rishi Sunak's had to get rid of, or has faced a resignation very early on, like Liz Truss faced problems very early on? Do you think then this is just going to be brushed over and this will be forgotten about, at least by most people? Obviously, I'm sure it will always be whipped back up again by the opposition, but do you think that we're not going to be experiencing any more turbulent actions like this, or at least not on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think it will be forgotten about fairly quickly. Gavin Williamson isn't a particularly well-known figure outside of those who follow politics, and he is, he didn't have a big job. Also, importantly, Rishi Sunak is popular among the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
Yes.
He has the support of his MPs, and so, whereas Liz Truss didn't, she wasn't the most popular candidate in that race. And then when she got into government, she put her own people in the top positions rather than a broad section. So obviously starting off on a bad foot already. Rishi Sunak is the complete opposite. He's left a lot of the people in power that he found, and he is popular in the party. So they're not going to be bringing any sort of reprimanding. They're not going to be reprimanding him for this. And he's also not the kind of person to launch a crazy budget like Liz Truss. He's much more aware of the trade-offs of decisions he makes.
Anoushka, what do you think about Sir Gavin Williamson? Is this an embarrassment for the government, or just one of those things that, I mean, as Ben was saying, it's quite common for governments of all colours to have people that do things that are not perhaps what we should be expecting of people with such high office?
Well, personally, I don't have the most favourable opinion of Gavin Williamson, because he was Education Secretary the year I was supposed to take my my A-levels in 2020. But I do think Rishi is more of a stabilising force than Liz Truss, certainly. But if Rishi was aware that Gavin Williamson was a bully, then I don't think there is any way that I can defend that was a good decision. You know, the party has clearly, time and time again, under Boris, under Liz Truss, proven to be so rotten from the inside that we need a breath of fresh air, and you can't be the leader of a party and allow for someone who has these horrible bullying claims at the top be in your senior cabinet. It's just, I think, quite frankly, it's disgraceful.
And when Rishi Sunak says that he wants to return to integrity, honesty and integrity that was perhaps not evident under Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, and this is one of the first things that happens, it does show the electorate perhaps that Rishi Sunak isn't quite as honest, and we have seen that his opinion poll ratings have already collapsed. Not collapsed, that's an exaggeration, have gone down. But it is important to remember that Rishi Sunak personally is, in many polls, still more popular than Keir Starmer, which is interesting because his party is polling dramatically below Labour. Damien, I believe, who's saying that he's living in Shepherd's Bush, is stating that David Bull from Reform UK, that is the old Brexit party, has said on his talk radio this morning that they're polling at about 10%. What can the Tories do to stop the political right in Britain becoming a more powerful force? That's obviously a question that's not entirely related to Gavin Williamson, but also just a brief answer on that, if you don't mind. Titus, let's go with you. What do you think to that? Do you think there's a risk of this with Rishi Sunak moving more towards a more moderate position?
I think the Reform UK/Brexit Party project, what the people who support them really care about is immigration. That's their main issue. And if Suella Braverman can demonstrate some successes in her policy, if she can halt the massive rise in illegal small boats coming over from France, which has been increasing exponentially in the last 4 years, then they will probably see off some of that swell in support. Beyond the 10% that they're currently polling at, I don't think there's much more headroom for them. They can't take over the position of the Tory party. They are quite a small group, and they do care a lot about migration, especially now that Europe is no longer a direct question like it was before.
Thank you, Titus, for that answer. Go on, Anoushka.
I do think it is important to know that we do have first past the post in this country, so I think they would only actually affect kind of the Conservative vote. I think they would, if Reform UK is polling that highly, it would divide the Conservative vote, which I think in key areas where Conservatives really would need to pick up votes in the next general election, I think it could sway things more to Labour winning in that seat. I think when UKIP was still a more prominent party, I think they only ever had one seat in Parliament, and I just don't see Reform UK ever actually being able to pick up seats. Maybe in local elections, which tend to be quite different, maybe they'd be able to pick up seats then, but in a general election I can't see them being a threat to the Conservatives.
I would point out this government is actually quite right-wing, though. I mean, the Rwanda migrant plan doesn't exactly come out of a left-wing summer of love.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it, how we define right and left wing and how that sort of moves around in time. But I suppose that's a discussion we can have on another day. But that is an interesting point, and many will, of course, agree with you, Ben. Others will not. Titus, just one last question to you, because Anoushka was pretty clear that Gavin Williamson is someone that should never have been appointed in the first place by Rishi Sunak. And I imagine Ben, based on his political leanings, would agree. Do you, Titus, think that it was okay if Rishi Sunak wasn't entirely aware? I mean, it's a little bit dubious how much he didn't know about the bullying claims, but do you think it was all right for him to have come back into the cabinet to begin with, or do you think that was a mistake based on his track record in the Department of Education and when he was Defence Secretary?
I think clearly the way it's gone down, it was a mistake appointing him, but I don't think you can look at someone like Gavin Williamson and say, you've been a figure who's known for being a master of the dark arts. You know, he has a tarantula on his desk. He was a former chief whip, nicknamed the babyface assassin. You can't look at that and then automatically disqualify him because he's probably a nasty person. Unless you have, you can't assume someone is guilty. It's innocent until proven guilty. So I don't think he should have necessarily ruled him out. Maybe looking at his track record and his some of the relationships that he's had where people have maybe, like Wendy Morton, they've gone wrong. Rishi Sunak could have considered that, whether he really needed Gavin Williamson, but I think it's hard when you don't know about specific allegations like this to preempt it and avoid that kind of person. Obviously it's come out quite quickly, so maybe there was something that Rishi Sunak should have noticed there, but I think before you know about something like that, you can't exactly not appoint someone because they're a bit of a bruiser, a bit of an enforcer.
Thank you, Titus. Damien, Talk TV producer, has stated that UKIP had two MPs, Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless, but Anoushka was right that Douglas Carswell was the only MP to be elected at a general election in 2015, but those two came in by-elections. They did win the by-elections. I think Douglas Carswell was Clacton and Mark Reckless was Boston and Skegness, if I've remembered that correctly. We're going to move on now to a second musical break, and this is a song that's been requested by one of our most loyal listeners, Amy. So do enjoy September, which of course was 2 months ago, but do enjoy the song.
On campus and online. Online. This is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. Our last topic then is Boris Johnson's resignation. Do you remember him, Boris Johnson? Yes, so when a Prime Minister resigns, they are allowed to appoint some people to the House of Lords, the upper chamber, which is unelected in this country, which I'm sure our panellists will have many comments either for and against on that particular issue. But we're going to focus more on his appointments, which include 4 sitting MPs. And this is the one that I really want to ask you about, because you cannot be a member of the lower house, the House of Commons, and the upper house at the same time. So it's believed that there will be a request to the King to delay the appointments to the House of Lords for these 4 MPs, which are Nadine Dorries, Alistair Jack, Alex Sharma, and I've forgotten the 4th one. Does anyone know the 4th one? No. All right. Sorry about that. So these 4, to delay that until the end of Parliament, which would be a very constitutional issue, really, because they're basically guaranteed the fact that they don't really need to try and win back their seats because they're going to be in power, regardless at the end of the Parliament session, which we were just talking about in the break about when we actually think that's going to be, January 2025 at the latest. So we're coming to the end of the show, so twofold really. What do you think about his appointments? And do you think that really someone like Boris Johnson, who was kicked out of office by his own party because of his issues with integrity, should even be allowed to appoint people into the upper chamber? Ben, let's start with you.
Short version, I think the fact that Prime Ministers get to appoint their own cronies to the House of Lords is outrageous. I think the fact that they don't want the fact why they're asking 4 MPs to stay is because otherwise they'd have 4 less seats if they had to go for by-elections. I think the whole system's a mess. Some of Boris Johnson's other nominations to the House of Lords are even worse. So no, I don't think it's a very good look for the government.
Anoushka, do you agree with Ben's views there?
I do think there are some quite controversial people on this list, like Nadine Dorries. I don't really know why she's on the list.
The loyal, ever so loyal backer of Boris Johnson.
I think surprisingly, there's also a very young Spad. I think 27-year-old Spad.
Yeah, youngest ever.
List,
yes.
Which I think actually was an idea that started under the Cameron years. So I don't think it's entirely shocking. I just think it's more his age and the fact that he was a Spad that I'm a little bit wary of.
And Tony Blair's wife's hairdresser, I think, was appointed to the House of Lords by Tony Blair. So it is a ongoing, interesting choices by the former prime ministers. Titus, what do you think?
I think that list is pretty embarrassing. Really, it does degrade the sort of the prestige and the honour of being appointed to the House of Lords, and it's quite naff. You know you can sort of appoint anyone regardless of quality. I do think it's appropriate for a prime minister when they leave office to have a resignation on his list, but I do think the circumstances where he was forced out in disgrace should maybe mean there'd be a convention where you maybe don't have a resignation on his list. Obviously Boris Johnson is not someone who likes to follow conventions, so there's no hope of that having any bearing on his decision making. I think that the appointment of Nadine Dorries is disgraceful. She is manifestly incapable of being a Lord, and she just shouldn't be anywhere near that chamber. The House of Lords does important deliberative work. They go through all the difficult, boring details of laws that get passed, and they update them, they check them, they scrutinise them. And that's really important, and I don't think Nadine Dorries should be doing that. It's quite disappointing, but I don't think the principle of resignation honours is bad. But maybe you could have a check or a balance to regulate it, or maybe oversee it, or maybe in certain circumstances there could be a conventional or maybe a rule to prevent someone who's been forced out because of scandal from having this.
Well, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Because where would you draw that line when quite a lot of our prime ministers have left office not at a general election? I mean, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, David Cameron, none of them managed to be removed by the people in a general election defeat. Gordon Brown was, Tony Blair wasn't, John Major was, Thatcher wasn't, and we can go on. So it'd be interesting to know whether you draw your line. But I think you've argued your case well there, Titus, as Anoushka and Ben have too. Well, this is the end of the show. Sadly, we do even have a question from Damien to Tory Titus, as he calls you, about whether the House of Lords is a rusty roost for third-rate politicians. But sadly, we're going to have to wait to hear Titus's opinion another time on that one. I hope everyone at home has enjoyed today's show. I'd like to give a shout out to our regular listeners, those in Dunkirk, including Sarah, Daniel, Ella and Isabel, and those in Beeston, Amy, James, Lucy and Ollie, George Scotland's aunt, who's a regular listener. Thank you all for listening. Thank you very much for Ben, to Titus and Anoushka for coming on. We wouldn't be able to have the show without our wonderful panellists. Please enjoy the rest of the weekend. And as we've been talking about the House of Lords, it's a song by Lord. Thank you.